Welcome to Plato's Cave. I'm Jordan Myers, and I'm a master's student in philosophy at the University of Houston. You're listening to a reading group episode of the show, which means that in this episode I discuss political philosophy with two non-philosopher friends, Adam and Giffin, because philosophy shouldn't just be for philosophers. So, with that introduction, please enjoy our discussion of political philosophy. All right, well, today we're doing a paper that is a chapter of an edited volume. The edited volume is called Emotions, Imagination, and Moral Reasoning, and it came out in 2012, which is funny because honestly, in my mind, like I pegged that as pretty recent, but that's actually a decade ago at this point, which is kind of crazy.
Absurd.
It is crazy.
Like 2012 registers to me as like, okay, this is like a pretty recent paper, but I'm like kind of.
A few years back, I remember it fondly.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess it just kind of depends like how you frame it, right? Like 10 years ago is not too long ago, I suppose. I mean, like it's Obama's presidency still, and
Yeah.
Still a decade, yeah.
Yeah. I guess if you're like, because we've been reading a lot of papers from the 70s and 80s and stuff, so in that context, it's recent. But but the title of the paper is Co-Reactive Attitudes and the Making of Moral Community by Victoria McGeer from Princeton. She's a philosopher at Princeton University. This is going to be kind of a continuation more of the first episode in the political philosophy series, the one by Niels Christie on property or a conflict as property, and restorative justice. That was kind of the grounds for restorative justice, and that paper is from the 70s, right? If I remember correctly, it was like 71.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah,
that sounds right. So okay, what I'm gonna do, I'll just give kind of like a brief overview of the chapter, because actually this is a very hard text to acquire, so I might post a copy somewhere online, because I actually had to buy this. I had to rent this ebook and then take PDF screenshots. It's disgusting, but so in this chapter, McGeer is kind of taking up P.F. Strawson's mantle. So this episode is gonna hang a lot on the previous series that we've done on moral responsibility. So McGeer kind of is picking up P.F. Strawson's mantle and following it here to its interpersonal and political criminal justice conclusions. So she has a commitment, she largely agrees, if not wholly agrees, with his way of viewing kind of the moral responsibility debate and the role libertarianism plays in that debate and its implications for reactive attitudes. Now, excuse me, her kind of buying of Strawson's commitments there, she argues, implies a shift in our criminal justice practices away from two alternatives that I'll detail in a second, and towards this concept of restorative justice that we talked about in greater detail in, I guess it would be 2 episodes ago. So she buys, there are these kind of two-pronged parts of Strawson's thesis that she buys and really motivates her theoretical reasoning. There's the metaphysical non-commitment thesis from Strawson, which is the view that indeterminacy or determinism via libertarian free will is not actually what's at issue for reactive attitudes. It's much more pragmatic and interpersonal and non-theoretical in that way. And the second is the metaphysical corruption thesis, which is one that she elaborates a little bit more on from Strawson. And that's the idea that if we focus both interpersonally and systematically on indeterminism, determinism, libertarian free will, that's actually going to corrupt our practical interpersonal practices with needless and orthogonal metaphysical concerns. And that's going to damage both interpersonal relationships, but for the context of restorative justice, legal practices. So in accepting both of those prongs of Strawson's argument, she rejects Green and Cohen's enlightened consequentialism, which it manifests itself in sort of a non-retributist, very consequentialist form of punishment, punishing people for the good or bad consequences it would produce. And she also rejects Goodenou's sort of noble lie retributivism, you could say, because he believes that obviously libertarianism is false, but because it's true, it's sort of this noble fiction. And Goodenou's view of retributivism looks kind of a lot like our current system, where people are praised or blamed or more specifically punished in lieu of them deserving it, or in light, of them deserving it. And both of those are based off of the folk intuitions of libertarianism, which she rejects. And she instead adopts and puts forth restorative justice because it naturally follows from Strawson's own views that she is drawn to, and it allows for the fruitful exchange of reactive attitudes. So that is the summary of the paper. Before we discuss it, what were you guys' thoughts, just kind of generally on it?
I thought it was pretty good. I think we hadn't actually read a paper that kind of linked restorative justice with P.F. Strawson's work. And what was interesting to me was they seemed to be so related. You know what I mean? Like it was like the restorative justice emerging from P.F. Strawson's framework seems
so parsimonious.
Yeah, it fits well. So, and I also thought I kind of want to go back and look at Goodenou's kind of proposition, but I definitely agreed that Green and Cohen totally missed the mark.
Yeah, there are a lot of really interesting things that I want to discuss with this paper. Because I really, really liked it. And also it's like a very easy read. Like it's like you can just sit down and just kind of enjoy the read and make notes, and everything was good. Yeah. One thing that I'm also interested to hear about is given, I think maybe more from Giffin than from you, but like given our previous conversations about the reactive attitudes, I'm almost curious, Giffin, what you think about like a lot of this too, because I guess I'm interested to hear the squaring of, you were sympathetic to the Summers paper that we read, remember? Saying that you can get almost everything with the objective attitude as opposed to the reactive attitudes. But then we all, I think to varying degrees, but we were all pretty sympathetic to the restorative justice idea. So as those topics come up, I'm kind of interested to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, for sure.
And also just kind of as an aside here, I think McGeer takes kind of a different line than Summers in the sense that I don't think McGeer, I could have read this incorrectly, but I don't think McGeer concedes any ground on the idea that people could come to adopt the objective stance in all areas. I think McGeer says like that's practically impossible.
Yeah.
I kind of there were like a few different paragraphs we could go to, but I got the sense that McGeer is like, okay, regardless of what you think of the two attitudes, there's no practical adoption of the objective attitude in all areas all the time.
She explicitly agrees with Strawson that it is psychologically impossible. She quotes from him there. Yeah. So which Summers would say, perhaps not. Perhaps it could be possible. And also, McGeer is explicitly sort of leveraging what she takes to be benefits only wrought by the reactive attitudes. That Summers says, no, you can get all of that with the objective attitude without the downsides of the reactive attitude. So I think they would differ strongly there too.
Oh, 100%. She definitely aligns with P.F. Strawson in the sense that, okay, like I think like even explicitly she states that there are many emotions that are still retained under the objective attitude.
Yes.
But for example, you could still have love in the objective attitude, but not all aspects of love. So
I actually had a quote because this was a really illuminating part of the paper for me, and it was one of those instances where I got it before, but it didn't explicitly click for me. On page 300, she has this really good quote. She says, reactive attitudes form an important subset of our moral emotions, but even given their rich variety, they do not encompass the entire range of our moral sentiments. For instance, we might feel compassion or pity for those we take to be appropriate targets of moral regard. But the reactive emotions, Strawson mentions gratitude and resentment as exemplary instances, are felt only towards those who we think meet more stringent conditions. Such individuals must be appropriate targets of moral regard, to be sure, but they also must be capable of showing moral regard in return. And that is kind of the grounding of her distinction of co-reactivity, which is really like, I love that distinction because I think it's easy to conflate reactive attitudes with any emotion, and that's not true.
Yeah.
So you could feel, like one of those, those kind of like aid commercials that come on and there's like sad music playing and they show like, impoverished children, and you're like, it's like brutal to watch, you know what I mean? Because you're feeling like compassion and like, I guess like a pity and like an empathy or whatever, right? But none of those are necessarily reactive attitudes, because you're not projecting anything with the, Strawson calls this, I mean, this is almost like his basic demand, with the idea or the expectation that they're going to be reactive attitudes shown back to you.
Yeah. I enjoy the quote unquote forward thinking approach that she utilizes there, where to find a subject fit for moral redress goes beyond just viewing them as a moral agent, but also with respect to, but also in your expectation that they respond with reactive attitudes appropriate to the reactive attitudes that you expressed. So
yeah, this is so the reason why I found this paper, this might get cut, I don't know. The reason why I actually found this paper, because remember we were searching after the episode and I couldn't find it. Well, the reason why I found it is I quote this paper in the paper that I just submitted to that Jerusalem conference about talking about taking the objective attitude when sort of moral redress fails, because like this paper is like infinitely quotable about that, and she lays out like, I'm basically just, in my paper I was trying to talk about the interpersonal I guess converse side of all of this, but she lays out, she has this one quote, I have to quote this, it's so good. She's talking about the expression of the reactive attitudes here on page 303. In the middle of it, she says, it being the expression of the reactive attitudes, says to the recipient of our reactive attitudes that we do not despair of them as moral agents, that we don't view them objectively, that is, as individuals to be managed or treated or somehow worked around. Indeed, that we hold them accountable to an ideal of moral agency because we think them capable of living up to that ideal. So reactive attitudes communicate a positive message even in their most negative guise, even in the guise of anger, resentment, or indignation. The fact that we express them says to their recipients that we see them as individuals who are capable of understanding and living up to the norms that make for moral community. I love that quote, because it's actually true. Like when we take the objective attitude, at least when I have argued it's permissible, is when that redress falls flat due to an error or a inability on the recipient side,
Yeah, and I liked the figure that she shows, where it's like a co-reactivity sort of trajectory.
Yeah, the faces.
I mean, it was a bit memeable.
Yeah.
I mean, but at the same time, like I got the idea from the picture, where it's like the idea that the reactive attitudes are more of an exchange back and forth, and we'll eventually arrive at something, in this case, forgiveness. And there's an interplay on both sides of what it kind of an appropriate reactive response would be. So if you express anger at someone and they just respond with like pure like fury, it's like they're not really engaging in that kind of reactive dance at that point, where it's like, you express anger, like you said you were going to pick me up at the airport, but you never came. And they're just like, they just respond with just like immense fury. It's just like, okay, I expected, perhaps like a little defensiveness or, but fury or, or what if it was just like jealousy? It was like the response.
It would make no sense.
It would make no sense. So there's like, it's forward thinking in the sense that it's like an expectation for, appropriate reactive attitude responses. So I don't know.
Yeah. And when that fails is when Strawson talks about taking the objective attitude as a place of personal refuge. It's sort of like a sanctuary from the strife of that interpersonal exchange. I have questions about how that she doesn't she doesn't necessarily address this, but I actually wonder if, because she's viewing it in that way that we just discussed, which I actually agree with, I kind of think that implicitly commits her to this like additional project, or I guess maybe not additional project, but it's a more specific project of the expression of reactive attitudes interpersonally and then restorative justice on a legal level only functioning when people do cohabitate the same moral communities to a significant degree. And I guess that degree can kind of vary, right? But there's got to be like some degree of overlap between people if these reactive exchanges are going to get off the ground, right? Like I like this is what, yeah.
That's why there were like certain points that she said, like for there were criteria that need to be maybe met in that one RISE project in Canberra, Australia.
Mm-hmm.
And we can go through some of those too, but I don't think those directly address what you just said. But I think there's some aspects there that kind of address that, because like like offenders admit guilt before agreeing to take part. They are then invited to participate in a conference to determine how their admitted offense should be rectified. So that right there doesn't address exactly what you were saying, but if they're willing to participate in the event, you think that at that point they're willing to at least hear someone or hear out the victim, and allow the victim to describe, the ways in which they've been wronged by the perpetrator. So I would think at that point that, I don't know, I don't think you'd show up to that sort of thing if you're not in the same moral community.
Mm-hmm.
I could be wrong, but I don't know.
No, what you said just made me think admitting guilt is almost kind of, you're like enrolling in the moral community there. By admitting guilt, it's like, okay, we're signing up to at least agreeing that we agree that like something was a wrong.
Yeah.
In that sense.
Yeah, so I exactly. So I think that it's not exactly what you said, but it seems like implicitly they're part of the moral community if they make that concession.
You know what's interesting? Then we talked about in the previous episode on this. I think it was in one of the videos, not from the text, obviously, because that was more the theoretical. But in the videos, I thought there was the implication. I don't know if they said this explicitly, but I thought that they said, because all of this is happening in the sentencing, that people who were found guilty could participate in this, but that they had to sort of opt into doing it. And I wonder if that's like I wonder if that's a better thing to do than admitting guilt, because admitting guilt, I mean, I don't know, maybe this like, do you, I feel like the minority of people admit guilt in a lot of cases, but I don't know. That's just an intuition.
Yeah, but I think this is like an entirely different system because, perhaps if like your sentence were to be reduced in this context where you could participate in this restorative justice, then maybe more people would in fact admit guilt. Because now there's no real benefit to admitting guilt in our current system.
No, there's not. No.
I mean, I guess there are, because you can take
Yeah.
a plea deal. To be fair, you
Okay.
can admit guilt to. I mean, there is a plea deal, so
Okay.
I should retract that actually.
But I guess what I was saying is like I don't know that it makes sense to sort of eschew it entirely, because you could imagine that like you're found guilty, like you commit a crime, you're trying to get away with it, but your defense fails and you're found guilty. I don't know that that's sort of like taking the benefits of restorative justice off the table inherently if you still want to opt into restorative justice practices, right? Like it
Yeah,
makes
I
it
wonder-
harder.
So
I wonder if it's like a semantic game though, because the thing is, um, admitting guilt, I feel like
Mm.
is
It could
almost
come
a-
after the trial. Yeah.
exactly. So like you could plead not guilty, be found guilty, and then by agreeing to participate in this, you're kind of admitting guilt anyway, right? Because because if you really think you didn't do it,
Mhm.
I'm not sure I'd want to meet with someone who's accusing me of something that I didn't do, and I mean like what productivity could come out of that? Like you sit down with the person after the trial is over.
Mm.
And you just
That
say
would-
I didn't do it, and it's like then the whole thing kind of
You're not in
just
the
like,
moral
oh.
community at that point, like the same moral
Yes.
community. Yeah.
So I think it's really important that there is some admission of guilt, so you're
Mm.
both on the same page before you even meet,
Yeah.
on at least
yeah.
on that front. So
Go on the okay, going back to the kind of theoretical side of it for a second, because you said like that there are preconditions that need to be met for this. This was one of the questions that I had on page 303 in the middle of the bottom paragraph. She says, what is more essential is that the recipients of such attitudes understand or can be brought to understand that their behavior has been subjected to normative review, a review that now calls on them to make a normatively fitting response, right? So there she's kind of talking about the co-reactivity. Excuse me. She's sort of talking about the co-reactivity there, right? But this is, okay, so this is where I had a question that is a bit more germane to the previous miniseries, but it's important here, I think. That sentence seems to imply kind of two preconditions. And she talks about the second one more. She tables the first one in a lot of ways, I think. So it's that seems to imply, one, that the person possessed the right mental capacities, and two, they cohabitate the same moral community. Does that seem, because I feel like if you don't have both of those, these reactive exchanges don't get off the ground, right? Like, if you're kind of dealing with someone who agrees with you on what counts as a right or a wrong, but they're unable to really, for just any variety of reasons, right? Like make it a really clear-cut case, like they're in a coma. Okay, obviously they can't exchange and reactive exchanges with you, right? Or they could just be like, concussed and sort of, temporarily, or they could have, schizophrenia or something, right? And just be unable to access that side of them, right? Okay, that makes me think that actually this is interesting. I wonder if the metaphysical non-commitment thesis I kind of disagree with, but largely agree with the metaphysical corruption thesis. So here's let me just figure out what I think for a second. Okay, so the metaphysical non-commitment thesis, remember she's pulling this from Strawson, is that determinism and libertarian free will don't have it, they're orthogonal, they're unrelated to practices of reactive and objective attitudes, right? Now I think there's a little bit of a lack of specificity here, because if the metaphysical non-commitment thesis states that the general thesis of determinism being true, so we just grant, let's just say determinism is true, does that have any bearing on our reactive practices? Absolutely not. It shouldn't, right? Because we talked about this before, but I think that indeterminacy would kind of vitiate like the sense of agency, paradoxically, because it would just, yeah, you would have no character coherence, like Wolf pointed out, or you would be like a wanton, right? So libertarian free will doesn't actually get you what you're after. It's incoherent.
Sure.
However, I think that if you're gonna endorse the metaphysical non-commitment thesis, you need to be clear that it's either just saying that first thing. You could summarize the metaphysical non-commitment thesis as saying determinism is not relevant to the reactive attitudes. That I disagree with.
I don't know about that, because I kind of get from this paper that she's saying that through the principle of co-reactivity, it's not something whether someone is fit for moral address to an extent is dependent on their ability to enter into the co-reactivity. So it's not important, to take into consideration like deterministic frameworks. Like, for example, if you encounter someone that is able to, co-reactively respond in a meaningful way that you think is, productive for, this kind of reactive trajectory that she describes that ends in something meaningful to both parties, then they're fit for moral redress, right?
Yeah.
But if they don't, then you don't have to take into considerations of determinism. They don't meet that requirement. Like they can't, they're not fit for moral redress if they can't engage in that co-reactivity.
So I don't disagree with any of that. What I was thinking about was, I guess this kind of came up in the Fisher 2012 paper we did, semi-compatibilism and its rivals. So like Strawson gives like a lot of examples of when we tend to suspend reactivity, but he doesn't necessarily say that those he doesn't prescribe them as instances in which we should. He just says that that's when we tend to, right?
Sure, the excusing and exempting cases.
Yeah, and he says that those aren't because of determinism. But I think I disagree with that in the sense that, so like if you think about, okay, so I think basically what I'm trying to say is a lot of this gets cashed out in compatibilist distinctions, right? Reasons, responsiveness, mechanism ownership, character coherence, second order desires, right? All of those things. Those things I think are going to be really important for determining both interpersonally and legally if these reactive exchanges can get off the ground. And when they can't, I think that the reasons why they can't are always going to show up as instances of being determined in the wrong way. This is the Wolff asymmetrical freedom point, right? So like if you think about we've talked about this case before, but do you remember like the Charles Whitman case? Let's go to the Robert Harris case, right? He's someone who's not going to be fit for reactive exchanges because he's just so fucked up. Right? Like he's just beyond the pale. He's like outside the moral community. Your address can't reach him. Well, if you're saying like no considerations of determinism can factor into this, I'm not necessarily saying that you have to be like talking about it in terms of determinism, but if you're going to be theoretical and talk about the metaphysical non-commitment thesis, I think you should be clear that it's just about the general thesis of determinism. Because the reason why Robert Harris isn't fit for moral exchange is because of deterministic facts about his past.
Well, it could be because of deterministic facts, but I think like, the kind of first level of looking at it is that he just can't engage in co-reactivity.
But then like,
right?
You know what I mean? The follow-up question is like, okay, why in this case? Like you might want to provide, like the court might want to provide like a reason why. Right. And those are going to be spelled out in deterministic pieces of information. Right. I mean, he had, you can grant that in theory, he might have a genetic predisposition for something. Right. We may be able to look at his brain and see that, certain parts are malformed or something, or don't fire in the right ways that would be indicative of a moral agent or something. Right. Or just talk about his upbringing, right? I mean, that's determinism. it's not, he didn't choose to be born into that family or whatever and have those formative experiences. So
I'm gonna be honest. I don't know. I'm just a bit lost at this point. Like I just feel like a few things have been conflated. Like I just don't get what the courts, because we're talking about a very specific instance of justice, right? Where
yeah.
I mean, these are specifically people that opt in.
Well, I was saying, so let's say the victim opts in, right?
Okay.
But it wouldn't really make any sense for someone like Robert Harris. Let's say Robert Harris kind of wanted to opt in.
Okay.
There's a sense in which he almost, it might, either the court might want to not allow him to, or at least provide like a dissuasive, kind of like notice to the victim and their families or something, right?
Well,
okay, like we don't think this person is going to be fit for productive restorative justice practices because of X, Y, and Z. And all I'm saying is X, Y, and Z are instances of determinism. So I'm just saying, like, if you're going to say the metaphysical non-commitment thesis is relevant, you have to specify that it's just about determinism, the thesis generally. Like, you don't want to say no deterministic information is relevant to this practice.
I don't know about that. I do have a response to that, but
Okay.
but Giffin, you were gonna say something there?
Well, I might just be misunderstanding part of our previous conversation with restorative justice, but I think in that case, like, I don't think there's a situation in the restorative justice that's been implemented where a found guilty party can request restorative justice where the victim wouldn't want it.
It was the reverse. It was the reverse for me. I was saying the victim signed up for restorative justice, but there's but I think that there's kind of a strong pull to, like, if we know certain details about the criminals, the offenders, it might be kind of worth saying, like, okay, well, we dissuade you from doing this, or we don't think this is going to be productive or something, right?
That is interesting. But I mean, so in this case, well, this is, back to Nils Christie. But I think those actions that you're describing from the court, I mean, they make complete sense, right? Like, if you're in fear of, like, some manipulation in some way, especially if this is like some sort of, like, deeply troubled person who, like, you can tell that they wouldn't be caring about the other person. Like, they, who knows for what reason they wanted to be in this situation. It's troubling. But
yeah, like, they could be sadistically going into it too. Yeah,
it's meant, like, I will be put away for a long time. I'm going to get enjoyment out of the confrontation. You can imagine a lot of those things. But I don't know if Nils Christie cares about that. I'm just kind of tying it back there, because that would still be, in this case, the court doing that would be the state, right?
Yeah, but
so this would be kind of like pulling, like, the property towards the state.
Yeah,
I just wonder also, like, don't you think, I mean, I'm just kind of throwing out this idea. I don't know how I feel about it right now, but I'm just wondering, like, would there be some peace found by the victim if they begin to engage in a discussion with someone that's clearly has, like, sadistic motives, and then they realize, wait a second, this person isn't even in the same moral community as me. Like, they open up saying things like, okay, when you attacked my husband and killed him, like, this is what you did to my family. This is what it did to the,
and then they're just cackling during that or something.
Yeah. Then at that point, I feel like now that you've been, like, face to face with someone like that, they're like, they just, this almost, like, I guess, nebulous concept of evil that they embody just becomes a lot more real, in the sense that it's like, okay, this person actually just is like an animal.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? This wasn't someone with, like, truly, this wasn't someone that's capable of, goodness and also evil, that just almost seemed to just lapse into their worst types of behavior. Now, this is someone that is just incapable of empathy and incapable of understanding, I don't know. It's almost like,
well, all I'm saying, because I agree with all of that, and I actually think it's congruent with what I'm saying. And you kind of almost started to lapse into it a little bit there, but I think the only difference is there is, like, the people in this, the best case scenario of that exchange are going to realize that certain deterministic facts about that person are true. Like, they obviously like the layperson's not going to frame it like that, right? But they're going to be like, oh, he actually was corrupted by this like insane upbringing. And they, so if you don't know anything about the person's past, you might not know why. But if you do, information comes to light about Robert Harris's past in the trial or in the sentencing or whatever, or from, like my proposed judge's like notice or whatever, like, hey, before you go into this exchange, like you should know this about him, right? It's all I'm saying is, I mean, like, admittedly, it is like a small point, but all I'm saying is I don't think, because I think if you say determinism is not relevant to the reactive attitudes or to their interpersonal functioning or to their legal functioning, I think you're going to commit yourself to disavowing information that is clearly relevant.
I just still don't know with that one, because it's like, I almost feel like you're still kind of taking like the philosophical approach where, like, you kind of sit back and, consider the like deterministic effects behind someone's behavior and their lack of, or their inability to respond appropriately with like reactive attitudes. But in the moment, like, I'm still thinking about, like, if I encountered somebody like that, I know personally for me, even after going through all these conversations, I don't think determinism would come to my mind. I think I would just realize that they're not someone who's reacting in a way that is consistent with co-reactivity or co-reactive trajectories that are appropriate. It would just be a recognition of that fact rather than saying, oh, because of determinism, this person is incapable of responding appropriately. It would be, the fact would just be, this person is incapable of responding appropriately.
All I was saying is that, okay, if you guys were both the victims of a crime, right? Say, your father, like, I think this is like the example you used, Giffin, your father was murdered, or maybe it was Adam. Wouldn't you guys feel differently? So you're in the restorative justice practice, you're airing your grievances. This is after guilt or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Wouldn't you feel differently? All I'm saying is I would feel totally differently if the victim had a normal upbringing, they were a college graduate, right? And they like committed this crime for no obvious sort of background reason. Like, they didn't have a brain tumor, they weren't schizophrenic, right? And then, the judge like slides a note over to me, and it's some piece of information, right? Like, this person has a brain tumor in the right area that would have caused it, the Charles Whitman, or like the Robert Harris, they had like a fucked up background. I would feel differently about that. But if the judge slid a piece of paper across the test and it says, scientists have just determined that determinism is true, it's like, okay, I don't, like, obviously I don't care about that. All I'm asking is, like, isn't that congruent with both of your guys' psychology as well?
I'm not sure. Are we assuming that in both these cases, it's this, like, the person is the same, it's just the background that's different?
They're acting the same. Yeah.
Yeah. So you engage with them in this restorative practice in the exact same way, they respond the same way.
Well, I'm asking if you would interact a bit differently, like, you're like.
So, like, would the knowledge that they graduated college and there was no like obvious like child abuse or anything like that inform like my view? It's an interesting question. I'm not sure. The reality is, I don't know.
All I'm saying is that, like, I don't know. I honestly, I thought this was like a smaller point, but all I'm saying is that all I'm saying is you want to be clear about what you're saying with the metaphysical non-commitment thesis, right? Like, imagine like, I just think that, okay, we're thinking about the theoretical underpinnings of restorative justice, right? Someone says determinism is not relevant at all. Do not bring up determinism. Do not bring up deterministic facts about this. I think that just impoverishes the view a little bit, because there's relevant information, right? That either like the victim should have, or the judge should have, or whoever's overseeing it. In the example she gave, it was a police officer, not a judge, whatever.
So what is the role of that information? Is this in like the finding of guilt and the sentencing, or just in the conversation? You mean, like, strictly in the conversation?
Well, let's not talk about the guilt because all of this is supposed to happen afterwards.
Right.
Because I don't want to get caught up in like,
oh yeah, no, I
pleas
just
of
wanted,
insanity.
I thought you would say that. I just wanted, to clarify.
Yeah. No, it's good.
I just like wondering about like the reverse of that too. Like for example, like say you were encountering someone like that, and in fact they were very capable of engaging in co-reactivity well, right? But then the judge slides across the table a piece of paper saying that they've got a tumor that is actually playing a role in their higher levels of empathy at this point,
pushing on their amygdala or whatever.
Then I would be like, what's this real person's self like? Almost, like
that's a god holding up. Like,
but that's how they're behaving right now, though. Like it's clear, like they feel a great empathy. They feel like they've wronged you, and they recognize that. I mean, like I think I
would just want to have the reactive exchange then after they got the brain tumor removed or something. Like it's almost like I want to know in that scenario, like, oh my God, like was this like, okay, imagine the guy gets the brain tumor removed and he is weeping. He's so remorseful. He can't believe what he's done. He doesn't know what came over him.
Yeah.
Wouldn't your reactivity change there?
Well, yeah, because the thing is, like, he's capable of engaging in the co-reactive attitudes. Like,
but he was before too. On your example,
okay, so
they were just different attitudes.
Okay, same example. I mean, like, but my reactive responses to him, I don't think would be any different in either scenario. Like, even like with the tumor, like I would say, like, this is who I'm speaking to right now. Like this person with the tumor, and they clearly have. They feel horrible about what they did and they recognize it completely.
Guys,
No. I was saying they didn't like, I was saying like, there's some like shame, right? Like, okay, imagine this person is acting like you or I, well, that's a bad example. I'm saying like, okay, this person has committed a crime against you and they're like, mildly remorseful or whatever. And you're like I'm assuming you would be like very angry and resentful, like very reactive in a negative way against them, right?
Sure.
And then the judge slides the piece of paper over. He's got a brain tumor. Your actions might change there, it might not. Let's say 2 weeks later, this is all still in the restorative justice context. He gets the brain tumor removed, and he's like. You're brought back to like the courtroom or whatever. He's weeping in front of you and saying like, I can't explain why I did that. I would never do that now. Like, I don't know what came over me. I want to do everything I can to make it up to you, but please understand that like, that's not me. All I'm asking is like, wouldn't your reactive attitudes change a little bit? I'm not saying you would take the objective attitude even. I'm just saying.
Wait, honestly, we have like so many different variables at one time here. I mean, like,
yeah.
Wait, you're saying did he have the tumor whenever he committed the crime?
Yeah.
Okay, so he had the tumor in this case, and but you're saying even with the tumor, he was capable of expressing, appropriate reactive attitude.
He would say something like this. He would say something like this. Yeah, he's like, I understand that I murdered your father for his wallet and it was wrong of me to do so, but all things being equal, like I had to do it. Like I needed the money for X or whatever. And he's like, it was wrong. And like, I don't expect for your forgiveness or whatever, right? He's saying all that. Then the brain tumor gets removed and he's like, I can't even relate to that previous person. Like I'm so ashamed of like what I did, but I don't relate to him now. Like I can't imagine doing that at this point. Like, I
think that kind of perspective holds even if there is no tumor, just by personal growth over time.
Well,
I'm not sure.
Yeah, but that's just that.
Well, I mean, I guess
all I'm saying is determinism isn't even relevant, like in the microcosm there.
I don't know. I honestly, like, I'm not even trying to be just like, just like, I guess, stubborn on this point. Like, yeah. I just don't think your concept is very coherent right now. Cause like, I really, like, it just comes down to like, I would, in that moment, recognize him as like a more appropriate agent for moral redress. Like, it's like,
I'm not denying that though. I'm saying that the underpinnings of that are going to be cashed out in like instances of being determined rightly or wrongly.
but I think you and I are on the same page there. I just think like when it comes to reactive attitudes, the relevance of determinism in the moment isn't actually that important. Like it's just it's the agent that I'm interacting with at that moment. So
okay, I've got a different way to phrase it maybe. Well, what was your question, Giffin?
Well, I was just wondering if what we were experiencing right now was that like the metaphysical corruption thesis. Like it seemed like Jordan, in the examples that we were kind of probing for like within the system, the fact that there was a bearing of the knowledge, the deterministic knowledge had a role for you versus like Adam, where he seemed it didn't have a role. Might be a moral community splitting phenomenon.
I don't think it is.
I'm wondering if it was an example of that.
I don't think it is, because remember, like I wouldn't phrase it as saying determinism is relevant. It's like specific instances of being determined rightly or wrongly might be relevant. So here's all I'm saying.
Because you're describing excusing cases right now, right?
I thought I was describing exempting cases.
No, excusing cases would be like circumstances in which you weren't fit for kind of reactivity or reactive attitudes, because
like being a regular citizen in 1930s Germany or something,
or like, because like the exempting cases is if someone's like severely malformed, you know what I mean, like they're just they're
schizophrenic or something.
But you're almost describing something like an extreme version of, okay, honestly, I had like 3 hours of sleep last night, and I didn't mean to say what I said. Yeah. So that would be an excusing case, right? Because
ordinarily
it's a more extreme case of that, where it's like, frankly, I had the tumor. The tumor made me do what I did, and
I just have a question. We should probably move on at this point. All I'm asking is like, okay, you're setting up a restorative justice program. If the sentencing commission, the governing body of the sentencing, uncovers facts about the case and about the person, such as their upbringing, their medical condition, information about their brain, etc., that we have good reason to believe is related to their actions. Do you want the victim to have that information or not? They can do with it what they want. It's the Robert Harris case, right? You discover that about his background. Do you just provide that information to the victim, or do you not? I think that's obvious a case where, just that's information relevant to the crime and the person offended. You should obviously provide that information to them.
I actually am not sure about that.
Yeah, I'm not actually sure. It seems like you're almost actually providing fodder for taking the objective attitude towards someone. You're kind of priming them to, it's like, okay, this whole exercise is to
but I'm not saying it. I'm only thinking of like the relevant cases, right? So like if you commit a crime today, right, and you don't have a bad upbringing, you don't have a brain tumor, you don't have schizophrenia, whatever, all of these things, there's not going to be that piece of information, right? There's not going to be that.
I guess to be fair, in your previous thing, you threw in information about the brain as well. So it's
okay, I should have clarified.
So that kind of okay.
Or if it's not functioning properly.
Like we've seen that there's like an array of neurons that fired in this way,
and that is obviously not responsible.
It's like you're priming them to view the person objectively.
And I agree that just the information that the brain did it is not relevant. Okay. It's not relevant at all. That was a misspeak.
this is a really good instance, because I'm leaning towards like no, only because I think in this system that is like what the role of the system is for like the victim and the persecutor to discuss things, including like whether they were.
But you might not know that. That's the whole point.
Who's
is
you,
like
the victim,
the offender. Like if Adam commits.
Oh, I mean, if the court like, so you're saying like these are facts that the court would know, but the perpetrator would not.
You might not. I mean, people don't know when they have a brain tumor sometimes.
Well, I would assume if it came up as relevant, then they would be informed.
Well,
like,
that's what I'm asking, though.
Oh, is that actually what you're asking? If there is information that the perpetrator has not.
Well, I mean, has not is like a little bit begging the question. Like they could be aware of it, they could not be. I'm saying like they might not. What if they were aware of it but didn't think to like divulge it? All I'm saying is that like if there's reason to believe that there was some malfunctioning that went on, all I'm saying is that information should be given to the person, because like Adam goes out and commits a crime today, we're going to be like, what the fuck, dude? We're going to be like extremely reactive, especially if it was committed against us.
I expected it all along.
Well,
dying breath.
But I guess though, kind of like going off your example though, like if it was me, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I go out and commit some sort of heinous crime against you guys.
Sure.
Do you want to sit down and just talk with me about it?
Mm-hmm.
Or
yeah,
would you rather the court provide information about,
it's not an or. I don't think it's an or thing though.
Well, no, I think it is an or, because it's you guys just sit down and talk with me, or you guys sit down and talk with me with information.
Yeah.
That sort of explains, behavior.
Here's the thing. I want the information because in 2 weeks, when they remove the brain tumor, I want to talk to you again. But if they don't tell me that, I might not know. Right? So like if you wrong me, if you commit a crime against me and Giffin, I want to talk to you before and after the surgery. I want to understand if your motives changed, if you feel differently afterwards. Like I want to know all these things, because it could be valenced either way. And all I'm saying, you don't have to like slide me a piece of paper, pretend I don't know anything about all this like debate. You don't have to slide me a piece of paper explaining what determinism is and all of these things, right? All I'm saying is like, oh, you might want to know that we found, we were giving him a medical exam. We found a brain tumor in this area of his brain, pressing on these areas or these, individual subsections of the brain. And it's highly probable that this could affect his emotional reasoning or his ability to have impulse control or something, right? I would be like, oh, geez. Like I would still talk to him immediately afterwards. And I would want to talk to him again after the surgery. And I think that you're robbing the victim if you don't tell them of that potential second conversation. It could totally change everything, or it could change nothing.
Go ahead, Giffin.
Yeah, here's what I'll say. I think I got a couple statements to make then. So I think
first, you're wrong.
First, I'm betrayed. No, first, I think Nils Christie would actually disagree with you. I do not think he would say it's the state's role to engage with that, even if it's minor.
Okay, I don't really. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No.
But what do you like? Because I'm not sure I necessarily care what Christie thinks, like in practice. You know what I mean?
Right. No. So that was just the first thing. Just because that was the first conversation we had.
I also don't know if I would agree with that or not. Okay,
that would be interesting. But yeah, I'll move on to the second point.
Wait, real quickly, just for my own edification. Don't you think he could actually say like no? Because then you're leaving it up to the state to like withhold information. Wouldn't I think that he might say like no, all of the relevant information. It's not up to the state to determine like what the victim knows and what they don't, right? Because like presumably, if the investigating parties found information about the crime, like I don't know, he wrote some like. There's like diary entries about it or whatever, and those are relevant. Like it's not the state's position to say like, well, we determined you don't need to know about the diary entries or whatever.
That is interesting.
I think he would be in the opposite
depends on
direction.
your because this is like this does pertain to the second point. This is the situation we're talking about is only one about like asymmetric information, right? Whether it's between like the state and like, you know, either of the parties. So in the situation where like both parties at least could have access to the information, whether or not they grasp it is another thing. I think then like it's not the state's role to like say, hey, by the way, even though you already, you know, possibly privy to this information, specifically, this may change your perspective, right? Like here's information that may, or, you know, wink should change your perspective. I don't think
that's putting a little top spin on it.
It is. No, I get it. But like I think again, I actually am still following Nils a little bit in that I think he would say that like that state enrollment, like this that role that the state would play in there would, you know, in some small way be a little bit of a nod toward, you know.
I think that's spinning it in sort of the opposite direction, in the sense that like, okay, it seems like Christie would agree, at least prima facie, that the state shouldn't, and I would agree with him on this, like in determining the guilt or something, the state, it's not the state's place to redact or provide information about. It's like, oh, we found him as guilty because of X, Y, and Z. Like the victim should know that, right?
Yeah.
Well, then I don't what's the sharp distinction between like all of that information and also, you know, okay, we're in a restorative justice concept. Here's all of the information about the details of the crime, and here's, you know, what we think is relevant information about his upbringing or something, right? And it, like, because again, we have to remember that for the majority of people, it's not going to be relevant, right? Like they didn't have a brain tumor, they didn't have, you know, a really fucked up upbringing or something, but it's like, oh, in these cases, it is. And that might change your reactive attitudes from like, I'm thinking myself here, like, I actually would want to talk to the person like about their upbringing in that case and be like,
right.
Yeah.
No, I understand that. Like the question is more about like, I'm having a hard time imagining a situation, I guess, specifically where like the perpetrator was not aware of a thing, the state was, and the victim also isn't, whenever the sentencing has already occurred.
A brain tumor.
But like, how would the perpetrator not be made aware of that in the, you know, fact finding or the?
Well, it wouldn't necessarily determine, it wouldn't be relevant to the level of guilt, right? So
right, whether or not they perpetrated.
So, you know.
I think
like, when would the state learn this? That's what I'm like trying to say. Like, if the perpetrator doesn't know and it's not relevant to the fact finding or the guilting, like.
Okay, well, that's a different, all I'm saying is that like that information should be made, that should be open access information then. That's all I'm saying. And honestly, this is like a smaller point than it. All I'm saying is that if you say, I support the non-commitment thesis.
Sure.
And by the metaphysical non-commitment thesis, I mean to say that no deterministic information can be relevant to the proceedings. Then I think that you're theoretically entailing an exclusion of information that is relevant. That's all I'm saying. It was honestly like it was a smaller point than. Like,
no, it was a small point originally, but I mean, I thought it was interesting. Like,
well, yeah.
The examples that came afterwards.
Because here's, okay, maybe I can juxtapose. Maybe if I talk about the juxtaposition to Green and Cohen, it might actually make this point a little bit more clear. So the problem is with Green and Cohen, and this was actually, I'm glad that you mentioned the appendix, Giffin, because they talked about a study that I was aware of, or at least I think I'm aware of it, if it's the study I think it is, from Nichols and Knobe. That's Sean Nichols and Josh Knobe.
Yeah.
They had this study where, pardon my ignorance, if it's the study I think it is, there was a study run where they asked people if an individual was responsible under abstract conditions of just saying like determinism is true, right? And it said 86% of people are inclined to judge in those abstract conditions that a person cannot be morally responsible for their actions in a deterministic universe. But then they ask them again under more concrete affect-inducing conditions, where a specific protagonist does something morally wrong, example, someone stabs his wife and children, then people are inclined to say that the protagonist can be morally responsible, even in a determined universe. Okay, that study, I think, makes total sense, because that's actually where I totally align with McGeer again. In the first one, you're committing the metaphysical corruption fallacy, or it's the fallacy of the metaphysical corruption thesis, right? Where you're saying, like, you're priming people by, you're just describing determinism, right? And then you're saying, can people be morally responsible? And the impulse there is like, and I'm actually going to talk with Eddie Namias, is a philosopher at Georgia State, about this, where he thinks that like the problem there is that people are assuming there's a sort of bypassing of agency, right? Where determinism is like, you have your little pocket of agency here, and determinism is bypassing that. And that seems like, people aren't morally responsible. But actually, because we've talked about this before, the general thesis of determinism being true shouldn't have any bearing on that, right? So I think that is like a fallacious priming of someone, right? But then they just talk about a specific instance. They say, okay, determinism is true. We just know that generally the thesis generally is true. But then this person goes on to stab his wife and children, and people say, oh yeah, like he's morally responsible there. Like that finding is, I think, is parsimonious with both what I'm saying and what McGeer is actually saying, as long as we just change the wording of the metaphysical non-commitment thesis or the corruption thesis to determinism generally versus specific instances, right?
You're saying that we should, and that's to buttress the idea that we provide information to.
Yeah, because what you don't want to do is exclude relevant information, because like all I'm saying is I'm just making like a very kind of, it's like a grounding point, right? So let's say we were devising this whole system of restorative justice. It hadn't been devised yet, right? And in our kind of foundation principles was we sign up for this principle called the metaphysical non-commitment thesis. And when we spell that out, that says one of two things. The first is that generally the thesis of determinism, that's not relevant here. The determinism is true. I sign on the dotted line for that. If there's a different statement and it says both the previous is true, general thesis is true, and also that no deterministic information is relevant to what happens here because it's exchanges of reactive attitudes, I would not agree with that, because I think that
when you say deterministic information, you
upbringing,
mean like
a brain tumor,
things that could reasonably. So I think I see it now. So McGeer, so that those pieces of information would not be deterministic in the way that McGeer is describing determinism, right? Those could be like maybe causal might be a good word, or like probabilistically causal.
I think it is, because I think she makes the mistake of saying the first thing, aligning with Strawson, totally reasonable, and I actually agree with that. The general thesis of determinism is not relevant, but I think that she then conflates that, or no, she doesn't conflate it. She says that that's true, yeah, but then she doesn't say anything that. Well, I don't know. Does she say anything that precludes the general instances coming up? I didn't think that she said that.
So you're open to bringing information that could erode the potential reactive attitudes between individuals, like the perpetrator and the victim?
Yes, if it's relevant.
If it's relevant. So I guess
what you don't want to do.
Hang on. Because like I'm not exactly sure what you're going for here. Because like you brought up like, okay, you said, say there was a tumor in the perpetrator's brain that was not known by the perpetrator but known by the court, then the court should provide that information to the victim to allow the victim to kind of incorporate that into their view of the situation. If
there's good reason to believe that affected the mental capacities of the person at the time of the crime or now.
So if the court had even more capabilities and they were able to scan somebody's brain and could recognize these 20,000 neurons misfired at this point, which, this person was seemingly rational for 25 years of their life, but we can recognize at this point, these neurons misfired. We're going to provide you with that information because it is directly relevant to their behavior at that point. You think the court should provide that if they know that?
Not if it is a well-functioning part of the brain, not if it's like a healthy part of the brain. So what I don't want to do, I think you're getting at a concern that is not what I want to sign up for. I don't want the brain, or I don't want the court. I don't want the brain. Okay, maybe this is something I wasn't making clear enough, and you're pointing to it. What I don't want to have happen is for the court to just give a brain scan and say, don't you understand? These neurons fired at this time, causing the person to do that. Because obviously, we've talked about this, there's going to be, because presumably we don't have souls, right? Like everything is going to come down to the brain. So what I don't want to do is have the courts just give information that, like I said, is not wrong, is not relevant, and sort of a malfunction, or
no simple
like
descriptions of what happened at a defined level.
Yeah, like I mean, my wording can be better here, but it's like no obvious, no clear and obvious malfunction or disease or something.
Yeah, it's like we happen to do a brain scan, and it seems like this is basically just providing information about how the brain works for the person.
Exactly. And Eddie Namias he said somewhere, when normal people, because people aren't like thinking about this at the level at which I'm saying it needs to be thought about for these cases, right? Like when you see these, like, the New York Times has like when you meditate, it actually changes your brain. And it's like, okay, obviously, like the finding would be if it didn't change your brain.
Yeah.
Right. Like
walking changes your brain.
That is where I think Green and Cohen can go wrong, right? And that was the first part of the Nichols and Knobe study, right? Where they just say that determinism is true generally. That's like saying, did you know it was the brain? Well, like, yeah, of course it's the brain. But if we have information that is like, oh, wow, it was actually, we have good reason to believe that it was this brain tumor, or this person had schizophrenia, or X, whatever it is. This person had like the most Robert Harris, like the most fucked up childhood you could imagine, right? I'm not even saying that. I really wouldn't want to say that it's the court's position to say whether that is something that should modify the victim's reactive attitudes in certain ways or not. All I'm saying is like that is information I don't think the court should withhold.
Yeah, I still don't know about that. I still actually just see your examples there as like higher level manifestations of obvious examples of things that could affect someone's behavior. Like, okay, it was the tumor, fair enough, that played a role in this bad behavior. But, what if, the court has in fact determined that, this person took a few of these vitamins that were actually laced that morning with some sort of, additional chemical that contributed to, their behavior that day. It's like,
I actually would want to know that.
Yeah. But the point is that you could parse it so that you could actually figure out all the factors that played a role.
No, not necessarily. Oh, okay. I think I understand our disagreement then. I don't think that that's true, in the sense that not all information would be valid, because it would have to go wrong in some sense, right? So you just said he took pills that were laced or whatever, right? What if, this person takes vitamins every morning and they're not laced? Right. And let's just grant, we don't have to understand how we know this, but we just know that it actually, like, this one neuron fired later on that day, and that was the neuron that made the difference. And we know that that neuron wouldn't have fired if this one vitamin wouldn't have had a 0.5 milligram. It was like, there's a tolerance on like the amount of vitamin C in that, and it was 1 molecule over or 1 molecule under, right? That's not relevant, because nothing went wrong there, or nothing was sort of out of place, right? So that if the court provided that information, it would to commit the first fallacy in the Nichols and Knobe study, right? Where you prime people with just saying determinism is generally true. Because all that's saying, so if you grant determinism is generally true, logically entailed by that is the statement that, okay, we'll be able to find, or no, we won't be able to find. In theory, there's going to be some reason for any behavior, right? I'm agreeing with you 100%. I think we're actually agreeing, but talking, well, I think we're largely agreeing that them providing just that determinism is true, or a subset of that truth is, that it was this particular amount of vitamin C, that it didn't go wrong, it was intolerance or whatever, but that was the thing that made the difference. That's going to be priming people to redress, or to fall back into the objective stance because of the thesis of determinism generally, which I agree doesn't actually follow.
I honestly just don't see the difference though between like pointing out like this person had a tumor versus we've isolated these 17 genes.
It's what compatibilism is. This is just what is at the heart of compatibilism.
No, because you're introducing information here to, in my opinion, that primes someone to view this person objectively. I'm saying
priming someone is begging the question there.
No, I'm saying that by introducing this information to, I think it erodes the very idea here of the reactive exchange. That is,
and I'm not sure that it does, because I thought that you already agreed. Okay, so you wrong Giffin and I later today, right? We have a conversation with you. Giffin and I are extremely upset with you. We express extremely strong negative reactive attitudes.
Oh, don't speak for me.
And okay, so we have that conversation. The court finds that you had a brain tumor, and in 2 weeks you're supposed to remove it. Are you saying that the court shouldn't provide that information? In which case you're excluding and preventing us from having that second conversation with you, right? Like, I think that I want to talk to you. Do you think it's reasonable for me and Giffin to want to talk to you before and after the brain tumor surgery?
Before and after the brain tumor surgery.
Because what if Giffin and I don't like?
So this is the case where Adam knows, though, right? For the first conversation that he has a brain tumor.
No.
The court knows.
The court,
Adam doesn't. We don't.
And we don't, because the court hasn't told us, because we don't want it to prime us or whatever, right? But like that
means it wasn't related to the actual. I think that what I'm having trouble is like, how did the state find this out? Like, how did the courts find this out?
I'm less concerned with how the state.
Yeah, I don't think
but like for me, it's almost like I don't even like the brain tumor one. Let's go even like more.
So you think it's not reasonable for Giffin and I
to
want to talk to you? Okay.
Well, hang on. What if like the court determined that I had 17 genes that, because of maybe some sort of radiation, had like, I don't even know, this is pseudoscientific, but like,
sure.
like degenerated such that I wasn't producing a specific protein that made me, engage in this behavior, or that maybe engage in this behavior. So would you want to know that? And let's say, through some sort of amazing CRISPR technology, they're able to then like repair those genes. Yeah. So it's like, would you want to know, like before I guess for our first conversation, that I have like degraded genes, and then for our second conversation, those genes have been repaired? I mean, yes,
and let me explain. Because in the first, so you even said that it was due to like some weird radiation that happened. It wasn't. So when I already said when something goes wrong in a way that is not normal, then I think that qualifies for it being relevant. Because then I'm not like implying a dualism or whatever, but it's like then your true self, or just in Frankfurt's terms, like your second order desire could be different than your first order desire due to something that was outside your normal range of local control, right?
Hmm. So you want to know of all excusing cases, like,
Excusing cases. In the cases where, yes, something is abnormally wrong. Because again, you've made this case like crystal clear. We don't want to prime people by just giving them specific instances of determinism that are totally normal. Like everyone is going to have a deterministic story about them, right? But like when we have reason to believe that there was an overwhelming causal detail that creates a really good reason, and you know what, this is like, we shouldn't talk about this now because I just will have to think about this. I wonder also if it would change based on whether the person was different afterwards or not, because that would make it relevant to like, well, was this actually a cause or not, or whatever, right?
I guess like the like I think I can like get on board more for excusing cases. I can buy into that one, but you need to like clarify exactly what you're saying though, because you're bringing up both exempting cases, like someone's upbringing, and saying, okay, this person, you're almost priming someone saying, okay, this person's not really part of the moral community, and they're and maybe they are, maybe they're not, but here's maybe a reason why they're not. It's because of their upbringing. But then you're also kind of like bringing up cases of excusing cases where it's like, okay, there was this character continuity, but something happened here. Okay. And, I guess I can get more on board with the excusing cases. I can buy into that. Like, yeah, there is a character continuity that was disrupted. And if you're going to judge this person and understand this person, it's important to recognize, okay, whatever their character might be, who they are right now might not be reflected, their long character continuity. But with exempting cases, I'm really not sure about that. So I don't know.
I wonder if it comes down to whether or not we can do something about them. So like we can't change Robert Harris's past, but we can remove Charles Whitman's brain tumor. And then you actually get to know as the victim. Whether he had a second order desire to do what he did or not.
Yeah, because I don't really disagree with like the premise that like, okay, if we can in fact like, correct your genes, and because of something wrong that had happened sort of recently, and there was a character discontinuity there, yes, you'd want to know, which version of me you're talking to, right? But upbringing, I don't know about that one. I don't know.
Yeah, I think I'm still on the side of if it's an obviously heinous case like Robert Harris's, then that's not information the court should withhold. But I think we should move on because we've talked about this for a while. I mean, that is that's the majority of the second part, but I don't know. I think that there's more because like, again, we do this. I think we do this sometimes a lot. Is I don't want it to sound like I'm actually disagreeing with the entire like paper because we talked about a small area of disagreement more. All I was saying is that she doesn't have to. I didn't think that McGeer had to have as strong a metaphysical non-commitment thesis as she seemed to be putting out while still retaining restorative justice. So I think in practice, really, I think honestly, the only difference is that like in my version of restorative justice, people have more information more often. That's the only difference, So maybe, one thing that I was thinking about that was tangentially related to that, but maybe it had more to do with where I was coming from than I realized is, so McGeer really does a lot of this paper is contrasting her work with Green and Cohen's kind of enlightened consequentialist view, and then Goodenough's like noble lie retributivist view. What did she say? So she says about Goodenough, she says Goodenough regards it as a useful fiction, the commitment to libertarian free will, playing a strategic role in regulating human interactions. Like, to be honest, this is I guess where like a lot of my grounding came, because I disagree with because both Green and Cohen and Goodenow think that the folk conception is libertarian free will, and that, you know, then from there they do different things with it, right? You know, Green and Cohen want to disavow it, and Goodenow wants to sort of use it as the noble lie, right? I just thought I think it's kind of misguided to think that the reactive attitudes, yeah, it's like the reactive attitudes clearly don't have anything to do with libertarian free will or not, in the sense that they're how we relate to each other. Do you know what I mean? So it's like, so to call them like a useful fiction is kind of misguided, in the sense that, like, they're not a fiction, like whether or not libertarian free will is true or not, you know?
Yeah, because like they make the like the faulty assumption that reactive attitudes are based on the assumption of libertarian free will.
Yeah,
which is not true.
or well, so what I'm actually even wondering is, I wonder if that is psychologically true, but for folk people, but there's no reason to believe that that's like that's theoretically true or like logically entailed, right? Because
No, I agree with that.
Yeah, because I actually do think this is an area that I disagreed with McGeer and agreed with Green and Cohen and Goodenow. Is I actually do think that the folk intuition, or like the lay belief, is libertarian free will. Like, I think people do actually have a sense that you could have done otherwise.
Yeah, I think I brought this up actually in like one of our previous mini series, but I just wanted to. So I made a note of that, and that's something I was curious if you guys agree with that aspect or not. But also, I am curious to see if that, you know, if that folk conception is true, kind of universally for humans, or if it's culturally dependent.
Yeah,
that might also have bearing on, like, you know, if we bring it back to restorative justice, it may, you know, bear on that, you know, the system implemented. That's
a good question, actually, because I told you guys I had read that book by Tamler Summers about honor, and restorative justice was a chapter in there. He has talked about, actually, there are cultures in which you're held responsible. Not only, they sort of like double down, where you can be held responsible for things that not only you couldn't have done otherwise, but you don't even have to do them. Like in some cultures, you know, so you can be held responsible for crimes committed by your family, you know? Yeah. And so, you know, you got to think, like, if you can hold people, you would have to think in those cultures where if it's not seen as wrong to hold someone responsible for something their family does, surely the ability to do otherwise isn't necessarily relevant.
It can't be. Yeah. Good observation, actually.
Yeah. Well, it obviously logically can't be, but people's beliefs don't always cohere with what's logically entailed.
Of course, yeah.
But you would think, I mean, I would have to predict that the ability to do otherwise wouldn't be a focal point of those cultures, for sure. You would have to think.
Yeah.
Like that
concept why gets introduced into the culture, and it's just the societal collapse at that point.
Yeah.
Everything just changes.
I wonder, I just thought of this right now. Do you think that it's actually, I wonder if this is inconsistent on McGeer's point to say that, so she wrote about that Nichols and Knobe study, right? So in when people are told about the general thesis of determinism, and then they rescind moral responsibility, that does imply that they're at least implicitly libertarians, right? Because, you know, libertarians and hard determinists are both incompatibilists in the sense that they think determinism is incompatible with free will and responsibility, but then they just disagree on whether determinism is true or not, right?
Yeah, I know.
So it's like, so, you know, that's why I just don't know if, like, I just don't necessarily care a lot about lay people's intuitions here. You know,
when you say here, like, what exactly do you mean?
Well, on the concept of like what we kind of want to do with restorative justice, like, you know,
because I think so. Yeah, so that study you're mentioning, that was only in the appendix, right?
Yes.
And the appendix was specifically, I mean, I only
was about the non-commitment thesis. Yeah.
Well, about the non-commitment, it was about the metaphysical corruption.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I mean, I actually didn't-
non-corruption. Yep, you're
Okay,
right.
I
Yep.
skimmed it because I didn't know if we were, going to have it as required or not. So I may have been mistaken there. But yeah, so it's about the corruption. I'm curious. So you said that, like, did you say? I'm sorry. Can you repeat your claim about McGeer here? You thought she had a contradiction? Like there was a contradiction in her thinking?
Yeah,
based
because
on, like, these two things?
well, I don't know. I was just thinking about it for a second. So McGeer acknowledges the first part of the Nichols and Knope study is descriptively true, right? It obviously doesn't logically follow, but that's descriptively true. But then she said
that she doesn't agree that the folk conception is one of
yeah, that's right.
That does seem to, butt heads.
Yeah. Did she
gets
did
around it in a weird way, I think, though. Because this is within the context of the metaphysical corruption. So she's basically saying, like, this knowledge suggests that, so like the Nichols and Knope study suggests that the metaphysical corruption thesis is true, right?
Yeah.
So it does bear a role. So I think her, like,
It's psychologically true, at least. Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So that does seem like a contradiction, but I think she gets around it simply by saying, like, well, everyone in the the moral community I'm imagining, doesn't have this, poisoning, the knowledge or any knowledge of metaphysical bearing.
Yeah. Because, like, and along with that, I think people are both implicitly libertarian, because I think there's this kind of clustering, right? I think people's views kind of cluster around, like, being libertarians and being dualists, because, like, a lot of people are religious and believe in, like, a soul, right? And even non-religious people will be like, like your essence or like your truth. People do kind of
spiritualism, yeah.
And then those also cluster with, like, this retributivist impulse. Like, I was kind of thinking, when you talk about, because she talked about this kind of peripheral benefit was rehabilitation, and I think you kind of do. I was just thinking about it, and you do kind of hear people call rehabilitation soft, or like they don't deserve that.
Oh yeah, you're not hard on crime. You need to be hard on crime.
Yeah,
this is super politically relevant.
Yeah, it's extremely politically relevant.
Decades and decades and decades fighting crime and losing.
You know what it might come down to? You know what it is? Okay. So we've talked about this a little bit. Oh, we talked about this in the Green and Cohen. You guys, you made the connection that was the paper we were talking about. The Green and Cohen 2004 was the paper we talked about previously. So we talked about it in that episode, actually. It was about the kind of genealogical debunking arguments, or like a subset of those are evolutionarily debunking arguments, right? Where you say, oh, don't you realize, like a fallacious version of this is, don't you understand? You only love your offspring, your children, because it was evolutionarily adaptive to do so, right? Like kin selection, everything. That should only debunk your view if your view of love can't involve evolutionary history or something. Right.
Yeah.
So that has to do with this, where the metaphysical corruption thesis is a problem, but it's only a problem because people have the wrong view in the first place, I think, right? So when you offer the general thesis of determinism and it undercuts people's willingness to hold responsible via the reactive attitudes, because that's a big asterisk, but via the reactive attitudes, that only works because people were wrong in the first place. Like, they have this clustering of like the soul and could have done otherwise and indeterminacy.
Yeah.
Right?
So I think it is like, so for McGeer, then maybe we would agree with this. Metaphysical free will has no bearing, but people's perception actually does have an enormous bearing.
Yes, and it's only because people are kind of dumb. Like,
in conclusion,
well, assuming that we actually I won't cut that, but it's,
I won't cut it.
I'm saying it's dumb to think that people have libertarian like souls, like contra causal. And I should have, I should have actually an agent causal libertarian on, because I honestly don't understand how that view is even coherent, let alone plausible. Right. But okay. Yeah, and then even distance, like, because obviously a philosopher who ascribes to an agent causal libertarian free will is going to have a way more sophisticated view of that than just the lay person who thinks we're all walking around with like little homunculi that can like do otherwise.
Of course,
it's not bad that we talked about, because it is really kind of the theoretical underpinnings of the practice, which is good. Yeah, is there anything else that we didn't touch that was something that you guys wanted to kind of hit on before we ended?
Let me peek through real quick. Yeah, the main comment or a question that I had was like the folk conception, because I thought that was going to be a contentious point.
Yeah,
not necessarily between us, but between us and the author.
Because I actually think McGeer is dead on about everything besides those two small points that we just incidentally talked about for the whole, not the whole time, but the majority of the time, because they're interesting to talk about, Yeah. But I'm saying this for myself and for you guys and the listeners. Like, I don't, when we do that thing where we talk about one microcosm and then it sounds like I'm against the view, I'm actually not.
Yeah. No, I mean, we did just kind of err. Otherwise we kind of would have just been,
we would have just agreed
discussing,
yeah,
like basically saying what it was, agreeing either with like the point or with the logical coherence of the point.
One last thing that I thought was interesting is that I actually think Green and Cohen, this is interesting. I wonder what Green and Cohen think about this response to them, because if they're being good consequentialists, they should actually be in favor of this view, because like as soon as you grant her like perfect point that the reactive attitudes following Strawson is how we relate to each other. Like, I actually thought this was one of her best points that she didn't talk about a lot. She said that, talking about Green and Cohen's view, we might be able to kind of exist in that purely consequentialist state for some times, but then she asks, but at what psychic cost to individuals in the society? I thought that was actually one of her best points that could have been developed a little bit more, because like as soon as you grant that the reactive attitudes are how we relate to each other and that's a consequentialist good, people relating to each other in more productive ways, then if you're Green and Cohen on like a purely consequentialist basis, you could get this view off the ground,
Maybe they might debate the productivity of
Well, but remember, she even drops that citation about how this reduces recidivism rates. It increases victim and offender satisfaction
well, like the current implementation of
the restorative justice. Yeah.
Oh yeah, no. If we're talking about just that, then yeah, they would have to grapple with that consequentialism, unless they're evil consequentialists and their values are askew.
Evil consequentialists.
Like, I value highly that we get poor consequences. But no, they actually definitely need to square that. I thought you were talking about like her framework of correct reactivity specifically, but no, they must address like the restorative justice approach.
Yeah. Adam, you seem dissatisfied. Is there anything that you want to talk about still that we haven't?
No, I guess I don't know. I'm happy with where the conversation went, but I guess I feel like this paper was, let me think about this. It addressed like theoretical aspects to moral responsibility, but I thought there were also practical aspects of how this could be implemented that I thought the conversations we had, it's not that it wasn't good, but I didn't think it was like necessarily fair with regard to just the practical implementation of restorative justice. Like, I think, because like I guess I was just things like identifying a brain tumor that someone wouldn't know, but then you're going to have one conversation with this person, but with the brain tumor in, then you take it out, then you have another conversation with the person. Like, I don't know. It just, a lot of this seemed like we had moved away from like the theme of
the practical sides. Yeah.
And I guess I don't know.
The reality is, if we're going to be reading like political philosophy, we're probably going to be, getting more of that. We would probably have to find something in political science that touched on, restorative justice broadly, if we want to address some of those, practical claims. You know what I mean? Like, and
well, I think Adam was. Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there were even things just like internal to this paper that I agree. I wish we would have had a little bit more time to talk about. There are questions of like, what I started talking about. I mean, it's kind of interesting to think about what you do when someone doesn't seem to exist in the same moral community, right? Like, bracket all of those the concerns we talked about previously. Like, I wonder, what do you do with them at that point?
Those are implied questions in the reading, not explicit. Right? No, there's actually a lot of those. Because it'll really depend. It's interesting to ask even like, what would Green and Cohen, suggest as consequentialists when they're not in the same community? Some dark thought. But no, it's actually important too, because I had a couple like thoughts that would, be beyond, if it would be a reaction to like some implications in this paper, nothing explicit, but about like the implementation of distributive justice, and like, examples of it that might butt against our notion that it would be consequentially good. Things like that.
All right. Well, Adam, I know you got to go. Maybe we should do like a tiny little addendum or something to this at some point later, if you guys want to or not. Because I agree. I think there were actually more questions than we got to. But
instead of an addendum, maybe just a follow up, like paper. I mean, like a full.
Yeah, I'd have to find something. I just don't know the state of like this literature specifically.
What was this paper? What year?
2012.
Okay, so there's enough space for a little bit of.
Yeah, I'd have to look at like who has cited it and such.
Yeah, we don't have to do it as an immediate follow up like we did this one for the Christie.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Anyway. Well, I like the episode still. We'll see what happens with the follow up, but I hope everyone listening enjoyed it and tune in next time. Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode of Plato's Cave. I always enjoy discussing topics with these two guys. So if you want to support the show in any way, you can do so simply by sharing it. I'm hoping to get this show out to more people. And so if you want to share it on Twitter or social media, that would really help me. You can also rate it on Apple Podcasts. Like this video if you're watching on YouTube, or subscribe via Apple Podcasts or an RSS feed. You can also discuss it on your own show and link back to my website, or you can connect me with recommended guests or topics to cover. You can get in contact with me at platoscavepodcast@gmail.com. Follow me on Twitter at Jordan_C_Myers. And I now have a website for my philosophy endeavors at jordanmyers.org. If you want to know a little bit more about me and my fellow co-hosts, as I said in the introduction, I'm a master's student in philosophy at the University of Houston. I did my undergrad at the University of Pittsburgh, where I studied mechanical engineering and philosophy. And now that I'm back at school, I'm hoping to more closely study moral responsibility, free will, ethics, epistemology, and moral psychology. Those are topics that I was introduced to and got really interested in my undergrad work. So Adam and Giffin accompanied me on this show, and Adam is one of my oldest friends. We actually met in kindergarten, and we've been interested in philosophical topics for as long as we can remember, and in a lot of ways it's been the basis of our friendship. Adam studied chemistry and biology at Cornell, and he is currently working at a law firm. And he's especially interested in moral responsibility as well, but also law, religion, and free will. Giffin is also one of my oldest friends, and we've been friends since elementary school as well. Giffin studied biology and economics at RPI, and now he works in human health research. He believes that there's very interesting overlap between both of his fields of study and philosophy, and he's particularly interested in exploring political philosophy. So this series was right up his alley. And with all of that information, again, I hope that you enjoyed this episode, and I hope that you get in contact with me or follow my work in any way that you deem reasonable to do. So with that, thank you for listening.